Today, I want to tell you a story of how a group of Chinese Americans were able to go up against the Chinese government's pressure for 2 decades and going, broadcast shortwave radio to tens of millions in China. Welcome to China Insider, I'm David Zhang. As technology advances, many, including myself, see radio as a distant technology of the past. Yet many forgot how important it was during World War II and the Cold War, and even to modern days now, as a powerful medium to deliver information. I recently came across a story about Sound of Hope. It's a radio network based in San Francisco, and they broadcast to China, and has served as an outlet of hope across the country, filled with censorship and lies for the last 2 decades. They cover about 60% of China's land and 80% of its population when it comes to broadcasting. Sound of Hope recently published an untold story in Chinese about how, despite the billions of dollars funding the state machine in communist China, they were able to overcome technological, monetary, and diplomatic difficulties to sustain their radio broadcast into China. So I want to share that story with you. Overcoming the massive signal interference from the CCP, their breakthrough technology, and most importantly, volunteers that sustained the effort over the years. To me, this is an American success story, and one that may go down in history among the greatest moments against the threat from the East. Following the end of the Cold War, many Western governments reduced the funding for shortwave radios as they no longer saw a need that once helped to send information behind the Iron Curtain of Eastern Europe. Shortwave, contrary to the short name, is actually referring to frequency. It has the longest traveling distance, unlike AM or FM, which only has about 100 miles in distance. Now, stations like the BBC, Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, or Radio France Internationale, it's natural to think that to be able to break through the powerful signal interference from the CCP, who else but a national-level radio station could do it? Today, however, the largest and the most powerful shortwave radio station in mainland China is not a government-sponsored radio station, but is entirely built by individuals. Sound of Hope is doing it with more than 120 broadcasting stations built over a span of 15 years. Around 20 years ago, in January of 2004, a group of Silicon Valley engineers who had just founded Sound of Hope gave themselves a mission to send real information to mainland China. As technology and communications slowly moved onto the internet space and China's firewall of censorship beginning to take shape, radio was a breakthrough point. And there was also a missing voice of truth in the radio space, broadcasting to China. The biggest obstacle, however, was money and access to radio stations. Most stations at the time don't lease time slots. Even if they did, Sound of Hope didn't have the money to buy or rent it. Plus, the CCP's powerful signal interference with its jamming network would essentially drown out the frequency, leaving listeners to only hear some noises. Sound of Hope first rented an hour time slot from Taiwan's central broadcasting station, and it was a relatively large station in Taiwan to test out whether if this attempt was even possible to work, broadcasting into China. And it worked. At the end of November 2004, Sound of Hope would broadcast the Epoch Times series called the 9 Commentaries on the Chinese Communist Party. And this was a special editorial which provided 3-dimensional analysis of the nature of the Communist Party and then what harm it brought to the people in China from various angles like culture, moral perspectives. From December of that year to 2005, the following year, there was a huge response in mainland China. People in Beijing, they would rush to go buy shortwave radios to listen to this program. And it actually caused a shortwave radio shortage in Beijing. And while it did prove to be successful, and it was an attempt to broadcast into China, it also drew the attention of the Chinese Communist Party, who mobilized large-scale jamming radio stations to interfere. Like a heavenly arrangement, however, a powerful person would come forward and start providing the money needed to fund Sound of Hope to increase broadcast time, which helped with the station renting out more time slots and going into a daily show. And so with more expansion, it delivered programs constantly into China. And that was going on for a while. However, another round of difficulties soon struck. The CCP was jealous of the continuous expansion, and they began to, directly through diplomatic channels and non-governmental organizations, put pressure onto the government of Taiwan at the time. The stations would fully cancel the leased time slots of Sound of Hope in 2012. According to Alan Zhang, the president of Sound of Hope, he said that it was in order to prevent the contract from being broken, he had flown to Taiwan 9 times. He even flew to Strasbourg, where it was the seat of the European Parliament, to Washington, the capital of the United States, to seek help from both the EU Parliament as well as the US Congress, but it didn't work out in the end. Now, of course, this didn't stop Sound of Hope from doing what they were doing, as they say that when one door closes, another door opens. This was the Alan Turing moment, cracking the German Enigma code. While continuing to fight for Taiwan's stations to keep the lease, and at the same time, the developers at Sound of Hope had begun to make some attempts around smaller radio stations. But the question was, do they even work, these smaller stations? Can they even broadcast into China? With their high-tech background, they started to build new stuff with the radio stations themselves, learning how to use integrated circuits to generate and transmit shortwave signals. They were trying out different sorts of antenna, which one can effectively transmit signals better, what kind of a location they needed for this broadcasting to work. When the first self-deployed station was built, it only needed 100 watts of power, which was 1,000th of the power of a national-level radio station. And of course, came the test run. 30 minutes later, the exciting news came. It was audible in China. So this breakthrough was a turning point 8 years after Sound of Hope had done the broadcast through Taiwan Central Station. And now they just needed to do the next step, which is to borrow from a term used by the communists. It was to use the village to surround the city. It was to build a coverage network large enough around China, around the border of China, set up by grassroots volunteers in countries like Japan, Taiwan, Thailand, and Vietnam. And that would then be able to broadcast shortwave signals throughout the ionosphere, which then bounces back to the ground into cities in China, and of course the countryside. It was like the island hopping strategy of the Pacific Allies in World War II. From islands to islands, here was stations to station, countries to country, sending signals. And these signals would hop their ways into China, into the hands of Chinese people. It was nicknamed the Seagull Network or Seagull Project, as the stations looked like the wings of a seagull. After the news came out, of course, came more bad stuff. The Chinese Communist Party learned about this, and they started using those large-scale jamming stations again. Once they discovered this new radio station, it would transfer the frequency, and then, of course, the jamming signal would come, and that would jam the signal. The listeners, again, could only hear noises. Now, what exactly did they do next? Before we get there, here's my sponsored segment. Now, if you're looking to get into Asian tea or is already an avid tea drinker, let me introduce to you the Taiwan High Mountain tea that we directly got from the source. Now, this is a limited batch of high mountain tea directly from the tea farmers in Taiwan's Ali Mountain, where the altitude of harvest is above 1,000 meters in elevation. Now, these full leaves are best brewed with slightly cooled boiling water to bring out the orchid sweetness. And of course, if you enjoy the regular green tea taste with the bitterness and some more like oolong tea, then you can do 3 to 4 brews and the taste profile changes completely. Now, Taiwan High Mountain tea is highly regarded as a premium variety of oolong and some of the best tea in the world. Now, we have a great product, but the inventory, again, is quite limited. So make sure to use my link or use code DAVID, and you'll enjoy a 15% discount. And if you're in the US, you also get free shipping if you spend $70 or more. So get this for yourself or for your tea-loving family member or friends this holiday season. All right, back to the video. So the attempt had given Sound of Hope an important discovery, or multiple discoveries. First, it was that listening to shortwave broadcasts doesn't require traditionally large radio stations to send the signals. And those large radio stations, they have power consumption up to the 100,000s, 300,000s, or 500,000 watts, and that people, of course, they're accustomed to. And even despite the high power consumption, they can still be canceled out by equally powerful ones in China. This continuously increasing in the power is the result of this arms race in the sky. And that essentially leaves these smaller gaps for a series of smaller radio stations to fit through. Now, the second was that although a large jamming station can cover the smaller station frequencies, they can never completely extinguish all the smaller holes in their signal. And that chance is very slim. So there's always going to be residual signals that pass through the covered stations. And so if they continue to increase the number of smaller stations, the living space of each of these smaller stations will be connected, essentially like connecting the dots into a large area. And that can enter China, and people can listen to it. And there's no way for the CCP to follow and track and to jam every single one of those signals because it's almost like it's delocalized. It's like threading the needle. No matter how small the hole, there is a smaller string that you can fit in there. Eventually, what happened using this logic, Sound of Hope increased their broadcasting stations around the border of China to about 120 plus. And to this day, the CCP cannot jam the signal of Sound of Hope. So that was a technological breakthrough even some governments could not do. And the ever-changing radio frequency here is the key. As a listener, as long as he has heard it once, he can turn the frequency of his shortwave radio continuously and find a small surviving radio station, and they can listen to Sound of Hope. But I think the most touching part of the story is the people. Because for the next 15 years since 2008, volunteers continue to build those broadcasting stations for the Seagull Network. One of the earliest Seagull transmitting tower was built in the mountains of Pingtung in southeastern Taiwan. Now, to build this station, of course, you have to find a place with high altitudes. There's no blockage around with forest or trees. Sometimes they're often in the top of the mountain. This location ended up being in an accessible place on a high mountain without a driveway, so the construction volunteers had to carry everything up by hand. Once it was done, though, it needed only to cross the Taiwan Strait to reach mainland China, but it could go as far as reach the Xinjiang part in western China. And this was all done by volunteers. Now, compared with Taiwan, like in Taiwan, you have a very warm climate throughout the year. You can live outside, there's pleasant life, you can access a lot of things. Building a radio station in around northwestern China is a different story. Radio stations like this are often built in wilderness and inaccessible places. And because of harsh climate, the radio stations often require more maintenance and parts need to be replaced frequently. And so somebody has to be at the station guarding these at all times. There was a couple who had chosen to live their life out in the wilderness to be the eternal guardians for this station. Living in winter, in harsh climates, surviving that. And that, of course, had drawn the attention of the Sound of Hope HQ, who suggested that they cancel the station and come back home. But they said no. Here's why. They said that this is our mission. So when the CCP was unable to block these shortwave stations in the air, they changed their tactics, and they started using diplomatic relations and to put pressure on countries where they know that these radio stations are located, essentially forcing them to use government power to force and dismantle these stations from the ground. For example, in the mountainous area of northern Vietnam, two people were setting up 12 Seagull stations in April of 2009. They broadcast 18 hours of radio programs a day to South China. And they also developed a very advanced technology that can instantly sense the jamming station covered by the CCP and then automatically drift the signal away to a nearby frequency to continue broadcasting. And this was all done automated with the computers. And so when the jamming signals followed, it immediately drifted again. And it was completely undetectable in terms of from the perspective of trying to capture the signal. And it was like they give the nickname called the Restless Seagull. But in 2010, the Chinese Communist Party pressured the Vietnamese government and raided the radio base in northern Vietnam. They demolished all 12 radio stations. They arrested the two people there. And one of them is Vo Duc Truong, and the other one is Lo Van Tan. And they sentenced them to each 3 years in prison. Vo, the first guy, he ended up losing his technology company, which he was the boss of. He lost his freedom for a while, his wealth, and his family was broken apart because of it. A few years after, when Vo came to the U.S. with the help of the U.S. government, a reporter asked Vo Duc Truong a simple question. If he had to do it again, would he do it again? And he said he would do it again. And when the reporter asked why, he said, because it's the right thing to do. And in 2018, another example, Mr. Zhang, a Taiwanese business executive, he was stationed in Thailand. And he assisted, again, a volunteer with Sound of Hope to set up this Seagull radio station in Chiang Mai, Thailand. However, in the November of that year, the Thai authorities had arrested Mr. Zhang after pressure from the CCP. And a year later, the Thai authorities sentenced him to prison. Despite all this, his answer was the exact same as Vo. He would do it again. So what exactly makes the volunteers of Sound of Hope not afraid to face persecution and willing to lose their comfortable life, income, and even freedom? Well, it's because deeply that they understood everybody inside China longs for freedom and truth. And the best thing for the Chinese people is to continuously send them the truth. And that's how they have hope. In Taiwan, during the Ma Ying-jeou administration, they had mobilized their troops in Taiwan to report to the government through so-called unlicensed broadcasts. Mr. Xie, a volunteer, was arrested by the police. But of course, in the end, righteous legislators from both parties in Taiwan began to work actively to jointly promote the legality of civilian transmission towers and to safeguard the rights of private radio. And they eventually, in the end, signed a bill and obtained support from both party members for the legislative yuan. So what effects has this done? According to Chen Guangcheng, a well-known human rights lawyer who was exiled from China in 2012, he says, back then I was imprisoned in Shandong by the CCP. Every night after I went to bed, I took out the hidden shortwave radio from the soy milk box and listened to the real information from the outside world. And he says that after he was released from prison, he was still under house arrest. The CCP had cut off all contact with the outside world for him, and the shortwave radio was the only contact he had. He said that Sound of Hope is the radio wave station that he listened most to most often and had the clearest signal. Another well-known Chinese human rights lawyer, Gao Zhisheng, launched the Olympic Human Rights Yellow Ribbon campaign in response to the Olympic in 2007. At the time, he drove 1,100 kilometers from Beijing to his hometown in Shanxi. Along the way, he learned that many people in China were listening to Sound of Hope. And when a reporter asked him how many people in China were listening to this shortwave broadcast, he said at least 20 million. So this year marks the 20th anniversary of the founding of Sound of Hope, and this is what Zhang, the president, had to say as a message. He says that we invite you to go to the end of the night with the Sound of Hope to witness the collapse of the Chinese Berlin Wall. We hope that after the disintegration of the CCP, we can all be like Polish President Lech Walesa when he addressed the US Congress proudly, announced to the world, Seagull is to China like the sun illuminating the earth, and back then, we were a member of the team that built and supported the Seagull Network. Now, if you, after hearing the story, want to contribute to help the Sound of Hope, then you can donate. I'll leave the link in the description and you can go click. But you need to use Google Translate because I believe it's only in Chinese. I haven't found the English link yet, but I'll find it. And if there is one, I'll post it. And you can also watch a video, which I will have up on my channel as well, and to hear the story from Alan. All right, so thank you so much for listening to the story today. And if you enjoyed it, comment below your thoughts, leave a like, and subscribe to our channel. Until next time, this is China Insider. I'm David Zhang. Bye-bye.